Next, we have Dr. Upali Nanda, who is Principal and Firm-wide Director of Research for HKS, a global architecture firm, where she is responsible for spearheading and implementing research projects globally. She also teaches as Associate Professor of Practice at the Taubman School of Architecture and Urban Planning at U of M, and serves as the Executive Director for the nonprofit Center for Advanced Design Research and Education. Her award-winning research around human health and well-being, neuroscience and architecture, and outcome-driven design has been widely published and cited in peer-reviewed journals. Here is Dr. Nanda on 7 lessons learned the last several months.
Good afternoon. I'm excited to talk to you today about what the future holds for the built environment. We're all somewhere. We're always situated in some place. And so for a moment, I want you to think about where that is, where you are outside of the screen that you're looking at. What is that environment around you? And what is going to change in that as we go ahead? But before we do that, I'd also suggest that that's a tricky question, fundamentally a tricky question. No one has a flawless crystal ball here. And we've been trying to gaze into crystal balls for centuries. So perhaps the question really is what the future could hold for the built environment, for the environment overall, and for us as a society. But why I worry about future casting is it's tricky, right? This is the cover of Reader's Digest in 1966, predicting what the world in 1999 would look like. And none of this happened, at least not at this scale. Social media, no one predicted. The Internet of Things, no one predicted. And if you want to have some real fun, go ahead and do a Google image search for what the world will look like in 2020. In the turn of the century, we had many, many futurists predicting what 2020 would look like. And no one predicted COVID. So it's difficult. It's difficult when we put the mantle of predicting the future. But it's also inevitable because we never design for today. We have to design for tomorrow. So we have to come into this conversation with a certain level of humility and readiness to be wrong. With that said, though, I'll share some preliminary thoughts on how my thinking has evolved over the last few months in particular. I love this quote by Arundhati Roy, nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. And maybe we take the conversation today as a portal as well. So we'll start first with 7 things we've learned in the last few months that may stick. 1, containment and mitigation. Rely on systems. When you're trying to contain anything that spreads, not just a virus, you have to rely on systems. You have to think about the individual, which is nested in a building or an environment overall, that is nested in a world of policies and protocols. You have to think about the communication ecosystem and the technology ecosystem. And you have to think about safety, not just as a physical construct, but as a psychological one too. Any solution that is purely product or space-based is limited, it's short-sighted, and it's going to be short-term. The second thing I think we've learned is this foundational concept. Access to light, air, nature, and fresh food is a fundamental human right that has been the best defense against a pandemic. But as a society, these things, these very fundamental things, have felt like premium offerings. How did we get here? Having operable windows is a luxury. Having access to fresh air is a luxury, to nature and fresh food has become a luxury. And if nothing else, the pandemic has taught us that these things are our fundamental foundational rights, and access to them makes us more resilient. So it has to be a priority for how we design. The third lesson is really the power of in-between places. And that's something we saw in the early months of the pandemic. We saw people coming out on the balconies. We saw expressions on sidewalks. We reclaimed our streets in new ways, and we reclaimed in-between places. We recently did some research where we found that for workplace satisfaction in remote work, one of the biggest predictors was whether someone lived in an apartment or a single-family home. And we found that those who lived in an apartment always had less access to nature and open spaces than those who lived in single-family homes. We forget about the power of in-between places, about the window, the balconies, the sidewalks, the thresholds, but life happens in in-between places. And these spaces that are connected during normal times become protectors when something happens to us. Lesson number 4, density is not the only problem we have, and it's not the core problem. And there was a lot of conversation for a while where we blamed density and we blamed the density of our cities. We didn't talk about equity then. And equity may be a much bigger problem than density. It's also important to remember, at least in the COVID context, that it's density in interiors that's a bigger issue than density in cities. And density in interiors becomes a really big issue because our buildings don't often breathe as we want natural ecosystems to. It may not have been a problem if we had more breathable buildings. But today, we are so scared of density. We are keeping each other at that 6-foot distance for some of those reasons that I talked about before, that they're foundational affordances that we are missing. And breathability is a key one. Lesson number 5 is local is here to stay. We have reclaimed our corner stores and farmers markets. We have reclaimed the small little places we can go to get our essential needs. And suddenly the big spaces with lots of people in them have not felt so appealing anymore. And so what we've learned from local, while retaining this global connectivity that we have at this very moment, is critical and is a big lesson learned, something that I think will stick as we go forward. Lesson number 6, flexibility, flexibility, flexibility. We cannot speak enough about this, right? This is happening at multiple levels. It happened in terms of understanding what our surge capacities are, operational surge capacities are, how our facility is responding. We had to pivot so quickly, and we did. We really did. We pivoted very, very quickly. But we have to think about flexibility in terms of short-term and long-term innovations. In terms of decision-making frameworks, thinking about what we invest in so we can flex when needed. And what does that mean for the buildings and the cities that we design? And finally, and perhaps most revealingly, I think we've realized that fear spreads just as fast as a virus does. And so things that are cognitive, that are really about what make us fundamentally human, have to be understood. We have to understand economics, public health, and just simple human psychology together. And that has taught us, and shame on us if we forget this lesson, about the importance of social connection, psychological safety, and the need for cognitive reset. And these are 7 lessons that I think we're going to take forward, right? Regardless of whether we get a vaccine or we don't get a vaccine, things change. Yes, maybe they will, but these lessons will stick. The other insight has been this shift into the additive, things coming together in new ways towards a beautifully blended world that we're trying to navigate our way through. At a very basic level, it's understanding that relationship between the human body and the brain. Understanding that if I'm telling you to do something that's physically good for you, I have to think about what is psychologically good for you. And that translates to how we design our environments. The second is the concept of footprints and cloud prints. The fact that we were able to take this entire conference remote, that's just an accepted way of connecting now, right? But think about this, that as our interactions move from physical space to digital space, something else is happening on the back end. You have more data centers, you have more investment in the bandwidth, and you have more connections, and you're constantly thinking in the sliding scale, what's going to need to be in physical space, what's going to move to digital space, and when that happens, what changes will I need to make? How quickly do I need to evolve and shift between the footprint and the cloud print? And this means a completely agile built environment that can allow you to do that shift between your physical and digital realities. This was the SoFi Stadium that just opened, if you guys watched the game last Sunday in LA. And if you look at this image, it reminds you that the cloud print, the digital experience, and the physical experience have almost the same real estate here. That's a shift. We are learning this dual experience world in new ways. Michigan is coming up with a Bachelor of Science in Urban Technology, really thinking about how digital services transform city life. This bachelor starts in 2021. Again, a shift. It's an embracing of what digital allows us to have with a societal thinking or sensitivity. And finally, and this is a huge hope, we are finally understanding that human health and planet health are extremely reconciled, interdependent concepts. They are not separate concepts. If we had a healthier planet, our health as humans would be better. If we lived healthy lives, our health as a planet would be better. This interdependence, this thinking in ecosystems, that's something that we have seen today. We have seen it in our times that we have to carry forward. Our future really will be around bringing these two constructs together, and that's critical. We recently did some research around this concept, around community block, around thinking about community-based ecosystems. And if we had community-based ecosystems, we would be able to support both business and life continuity. And that's what we need to go towards, right? Ecosystems, ecological thinking, because humans are systems. If humans are systems and nature is a system, then why aren't our buildings and built environments living systems too? And with that, I'll wrap up with 3 concepts, just the alphabet, the ABC, that I think we really need to think hard about as a starting point of how we shape this future, not just predict it. The first is rigidity is not going to help us. Our rate of change as a civilization has continued to accelerate. And that means we have to be super agile. We cannot think of complex, multi-year, beautiful projects that stay in the state that you designed them forever. We have to think about almost space shuttles, buildings that can transform, reconfigure, reshape themselves, neighborhoods that can reshape, cities that can reshape. A hyper-agile society that is responsive to the needs of its times. What does that mean for the way we design? The second, and I think this has been perhaps the biggest aha moment, this realization, is our right to breathe and this concept of breathability. When our breath is held hostage, everything stops. Our breath was held hostage when we first witnessed the virus. Our breath was held hostage when we started talking about Black Lives Matter again. Our breath was held hostage in the wildfires. When breath is held hostage, everything else stops. So breathability, fundamentally thinking about breathability and saying if we need to breathe to survive, then shouldn't our buildings breathe too? Shouldn't our cities breathe too? And that's a foundational concept that is calling out to all of the technologies, digital and material, to say, can we make our materials breathe? Can we make our technology breathe? Can we make our cities and our buildings and our societies breathe again? So agility, breathability, and the last concept I would share is around consciousness. There is no doubt that we have an incredible data infrastructure and greater things are about to happen. We are going to see revolutions in all things related to technology. And certainly we have huge amounts of information and huge amounts of access to information today. We have a great amount of awareness, but perhaps we do not have the required amount of consciousness. And there's a distinction there because consciousness means our ability to connect our physical and digital worlds towards a purpose that is more collective. Be aware that everything that I do, no matter what my role is or how small my agency, whatever I do has a ripple effect. To be conscious of every action I take and the impact it has on the bigger ecosystem that I work within. And so we really have to move from an informed, data-driven society to a conscious society. And that really would be where I would end. Agility, breathability, and fundamental consciousness to take us into this new era. Whatever that looks like, we cannot completely predict. We don't really know. In some things, we'll speed up. In some things, we'll slow down. But if we are responsive, if you're agile, if we really, really focus on breath, on breathability, and if you're conscious, we will be crafting a better future for all of us. Thank you so much for your time.
I agree, Dr. Nanda. We will craft a better future for all of us.